At this critical juncture, Sri Lanka's relationship with the international community as a whole is a tenuous one. In terms of supplying aid in all its forms, their generosity has been unparalleled, but there are those who believe that their involvement should stop there. Sanchia spoke with Professor Rajiva Wijesinha, the Secretary General of the Secretariat for Coordinating the Peace Process, to ascertain the government's views on this matter.
Thank you, Professor Wijesinha, for talking to us, especially about the involvement of the international community regarding Sri Lanka's prevailing humanitarian situation. Now, last week, Sri Lanka saw a number of visits from UN delegates as well as representatives of foreign governments to assess the humanitarian situation in the country. Now, first of all, what role does Sri Lanka expect from the international community?
Well, obviously, the most important thing is to gain assistance for our people. And in the current context, it is obviously vital with so many hundreds of thousands coming out to ensure that they get the best possible deal. It's also, I think, important to show people exactly what the situation is and how these poor people have been kept by force by the LTT for so long, and their sheer relief at being able to get out. So I think it's important for us to engage with these people. And of course, a lot of them tend to only have what I would call the LTT propaganda type point of view, which is exacerbated by a lot of LTT orchestrated demonstrations. And some of them don't really realize what the real situation is.
British Foreign Secretary David Miliband and France's Minister of Foreign Affairs Bernard Kouchner's visit last week has caused a bit of controversy in the country. There were protests in the country, and even the Defence Secretary has said that their visit was a waste of time. Can I ask you, why did the Sri Lankan government request for these people to come down to Sri Lanka?
Well, it's not the Sri Lankan government request. The way these things work is they call and say, can we come? And as you know, Sri Lankans are generally terribly polite people and say yes. And I think Mr. Kouchner's visit, he's the one who first asked, as far as I know. And it was welcome because the French have really been very helpful. They actually set up a field hospital there. And I think Sri Lanka was quite delighted to have Mr. Kouchner. And as you know, the French ambassador in Sri Lanka has, while being a highly principled person, has been enormously helpful in terms of aid and assistance. I think that when Mr. Miliband called, we tend to be very British in our approach, and I suppose they thought they should say yes. I don't think it would have been a problem, except that then it was presented as an EU visit. And you see, that wasn't really why we had first wanted Mr. Kouchner. Obviously, Mr. Miliband wanted to come with him. I think he would have really served the British cause much better if, while saying, of course, we must do our best for our fellow citizens, which we know already. We don't need him to tell us, but, it's nice to have assistance for this. If he had not been so ambiguous about the LTT, I think that was tragic, and I think that really is what led to all these suspicions about the poor guy.
Few additional developments, such as the JHU protest against the involvement of the international community, and there have also been several posters in Colombo itself against the visit of Miliband and Kouchner, and this has led us to believe that their visit to the country has come across as somewhat of a threat. Is this the case?
Well, I don't know whether it's a threat, but obviously there is a fear, which is, I think, a genuine fear on the part of some people. I'm not saying that it's justified, but I can understand the fear that this intervention is designed to help the LTT. As I said, he could have dealt with it very firmly by saying the LTT should surrender. But when you are ambiguous and when you sort of suggest that you want the LTT not to surrender, to have another life that's not terror, compare their approach to that with the approach to other terrorist groups, you realize that's an ambiguity, and that gives rise to certain suspicions. So even though I believe that in the long run, no one really wants terror to go on, when people start playing politics and start playing politics with people's lives, because this gives the LTT the hope that they have a lifeline, and therefore they're more intransigent about hanging on to the civilians they have, I think it's actually wickedness. And I think, people should grow up and realize that anything anyone tells us about principles is fine, but anything that seems to support terrorism actually gives support to terrorists, even though it wasn't intended. And if they're not old enough to realize that, they shouldn't be, pronouncing about countries which are suffering.
So, despite even though there's been so much of controversy going on with the international involvement of the international community, are we likely to expect more representatives of foreign governments in the country?
Well, I'm sure many people would like to come. I think one of the things they have to realize is that they do disrupt the efforts. You know, for instance, they were telling me, I was in Vavuniya last week, and they said the day they had no visitors, they managed to put up hundreds of shelters. The day the guys came, things slowed down. So, you know, I don't think these people really understand that when they go up, we have to be careful about their security. There's a lot of interruption of work. You know, there's a thin line, I think, between genuine concern and, of course, we welcome concern that's accompanied by concrete efforts, like the French hospital. And, you know, to give the British their due, £2.5 million a pledge, but of course that was much more the very quiet and I think rather dignified Mike Foster, who came and looked at things, and that's the Department of International Development. And in fact, when I met an official and said, your big boss is coming tomorrow, she said, no, that's not my boss. So the Department of International Cooperation, I think, would do its best, but some of the other things are more grandstanding. And we would prefer not to have grandstanding that interrupts the tremendous efforts. I mean, the poor army is working 24 hours a day in clearing land. UNHCR has been putting up tents. UNICEF is a bit slower, and, you know, we find their toilets could be a bit better, but they are doing their best. So when in the midst of that someone turns up, and, you know, they have to explain what they're doing to 10 people 10 times.
So you're saying it interrupts the development.
It interrupts the
of the country.
The smooth flow of assistance. And heavens, it was a tough job. And I think it's remarkable what they've done in a week to settle 120,000 people. But there's obviously much more to do.
And finally, in a report in the media, Miliband and Kushner have said that as members of the UN Security Council, they will not shy away from the responsibility of sovereign governments and the international community to protect civilians. In your opinion, is this what they should be doing?
Well, I think the problem there is, again, it's very political because, you know, you have double standards. For instance, the Pakistani army says that they will not fight with the Taliban because they don't want to harm civilians, and there's criticism of that. So, you know, when you have such double standards all over, you begin to worry really about what people's motivation is. I should say that I don't think there is a determination to support terrorism. I think that's a wrong reading, but there's certainly a carelessness about the consequences of their actions and a failure to recognize. I think he's more Miliband than Kushner, because Mr. Kushner has generally been very circumspect. You know, he has certain principles which he would enunciate, and he doesn't have the same political pressures. But as we have seen from a lot of the activities of the British, you know, they were the people, the then ambassador in Geneva said to me very clearly, they wanted a motion against us. And when our then ambassador managed to stave this off, he said, you know, your ambassador thinks he's won, but let's see. So although I think his successor was a much more civilized man, you know, we have to remember their compulsions, and of course electoral compulsions. And, you know, however they dress it up in, let us say, humanitarian words, we can understand from the ambiguities and the double standards that it's a political game they're playing. And I suppose that's understandable. I mean, what is a politician to do after all, except try to get elected?
Despite the challenges involved, much is being done by local and international communities alike to help the displaced people in the north. But what about other marginalized communities in the country whose plight does not attract as much attention? We take a look at one such community after the break.